As most of you, I think, have picked up by now, my degree was in American history. I did graduate work as an historian. And I think that, so especially early American history, and probably overwhelming majority of historians looking back at the history of America would say the greatest American president was Abraham Lincoln. We think of him as this great successful leader who saw us through the Civil War, freed the slaves, etc. But you wouldn't know it from his early life. And I was thinking about this. I've read a lot about Lincoln, etc., in his history, but also just for my own enjoyment. But I was interested in a way in which Matthew Kelly, one of the Catholic apologists, had sort of organized his life a little bit. He went like this. So Lincoln was born in poverty. Poor family. He's born in 1809. He was an ambitious man who wanted to improve himself. But to do this, he struggled to get out of where he had begun. It was a long slog. So in 1831, he was 22 years, and his business failed. He lost his business. In 1832, he ran for the state legislature and lost. Same year, he lost another job. He decided, well, I'll go to law school. But the law school rejected him and turned him down, so he had to study on his own. And so in 1833, he borrowed money from a friend to begin another business. Try again. He went bankrupt, spent the next 17 years trying to pay off that debt, successfully paying off the debt. So in 1834, he said, I'll run for the state legislature. Again, he lost. In 1835, he was engaged to be married, but his fiancée died, and he had a mental breakdown. And so in 1838, decided to run for legislature again. And this time he won, finally. So he said, well, I'll move up. 1844, he decides to run for Congress. He loses. 1846, I'll run again. He wins. He wins in 1846 for 2 years, but then in the bid to be reelected, he loses. And it's a theme of this that when he fails, he says, I'll just aim higher. So in 1854, he says, I'll run for the Senate. He loses. So he said, well, I'll run for vice president. So he sought to be vice president candidate of the Republican Party. He loses badly. So he said, okay, in 1858, I'll run for Senate. And he loses. And so again, given that track record, you wonder, so what makes you think you're going to be president in 1860? Well, he says, if I lose, I just aim higher. And so he wins the election, saves the country during the Civil War that began just a few months after his election. So I mentioned that because I think when you put the pieces together like that, and I'm not saying there aren't bright lights among those years. Again, he was elected to the legislature. He had one term as a congressman, but still, it's an example of, I think, incredible perseverance in the face of difficulty and failure, and easily could be demoralizing. And we could perhaps explain Lincoln's success by his natural gifts or his temperament or whatever, but his life reminded me of our gospel and the power of God's supernatural grace in a leader that was even greater than Abraham Lincoln, St. Peter, the first pope, Vicar of Christ on earth. So again, his story. So in today's gospel, Christ is telling Peter to cast his nets one more time. I at least hear Peter's frustration in this, saying, okay, he's discouraged. He's been working hard at this all night. They've been skunked. There's no fish. He tries again, but it's reluctantly out of respect alone for the insistence of Jesus. Okay, I'll do it, but what's the use? Again, that's the mental thought process I imagine going through his head. So when he sees this great catch of fish, Peter is not struck only in amazement by that miraculous experience, but also he's struck with his own unworthiness because he doubted the value of trying again, and he doubted the power of Jesus. He's realized the fish show that up to him, and the scales fall from his eyes, and he realizes, this is who I am. And I see in that reaction, I think Peter's own doubting of Christ. That can be our experience. That is really, in our own life, in our own trying to follow his call to live life according to his plan, that we find it's a long, hard struggle to defeat sin and to live the virtues. This is hard. And we're all called to be saints. So we may think that's impossible. But you think about it, it's the American ideal that anybody can grow up to be president, right? That's what we tell ourselves. And I think one of the great examples of that possibility would be Abraham Lincoln. Not a whole lot going for him when he was born in 1809. You would not have this guy in this rundown house, this family that's all pretty dysfunctional, that this guy would be the greatest president in American history. You wouldn't have thought of that. But it's also Catholic doctrine. It's not just American dream and thought that anybody can be president. It's the Catholic doctrine that anybody can be a saint. We're not talking about canonized saint. That's according to his plan. But someone who's radically filled with the fullness of God, as Ephesians 3 tells us. That we can have the heroic virtue of completely being filled and doing God's will. The ultimate happiness as a human. We're all called to that. We can all be a saint, whether it's a common fisherman, whether it's you, whether it's me. That's why we were created. That's the point of our life. And what keeps us from that ultimate happiness, for most of us at least, is not one huge sin that's wrecked our lives. It's mostly the long slog against habitual sins that have become part of us and that we cannot seem to erase or defeat. And that demoralizes us and it defeats us and it makes us think we cannot do this. It might be a temper. You just can't curb the temper. It snaps at people the way you don't want it to. It could be a sinful sexual behavior. You seem to try to stop it, you can't. Or it could be complaining about other people or belittling them. Who knows? We all have our own thing. But we've tried long and hard, maybe all our lives, to be rid of these obstacles to our relationship with Christ. And we've prayed maybe, but with no apparent result. And we've worked hard all night and we've caught nothing. And what does Jesus try to tell us to do? Try again. Cast the nets. And like Peter, we have faith, but at the same time, we doubt the possibility of what Jesus is asking us to do. So these things coincide in our lives. Do I believe in Jesus? Yes. Do I think I can do what he wants me to do? I have not had that experience. But today in the gospel, something else happens to Peter. This time the net brings up a greater fish than he ever hoped for. It blew away his image of how fishing is supposed to be. He says that Jesus can take care of things the way in which my human nature and my human knowledge don't compute here. He does things that I can't do. This is the story of how God's grace works in our lives. The life of a disciple of Jesus is hard work. It's one of the great lessons here. It doesn't mean that the faith we work hard to become faithful, faith is a gift, but then when we have this faith, how do we use it to grow? How do we allow God to fill us? What do we have to move out and what do we have to do? Again, it's work. Often seemingly endless or fruitful work. Think of the young Lincoln and his struggles. Year after year. So it's easy to become frustrated with repeated depressing failure. And then that's why we give up. I was thinking, how many times have you tried to, Father, I've tried to do that 20 minutes, nothing happens. Or I've tried to read the Bible and I slog, I can't do it. Can't do it. But the gospel tells us that if we continue to answer Jesus' call to try again, we eventually win the victory through his power, not ours. So but to do that, we have to really confront the reality of our lives, which is, in fact, our sinfulness, our frailty, our weakness, and our true relationship with Christ, which is one of dependence on his strength. So we have to work, but we can't defeat our sins ourselves. To change so fundamentally requires grace and strength that comes from God alone. We have to throw the net, but only God can fill it. But we have to throw the net. So again, it's that togetherness, God's grace and my willingness to lay myself out. So perhaps we imagine Lincoln has all these natural virtues. He has this intelligence. He has this temperament, whatever. And that explains why he saw him through the political defeats that he had, even personal defeats. It's hard to think about that about St. Peter. Again, a person you would not have thought of as being God chosen, but then God chooses the small and the unlikely all the time. But again, he fails all the time in life as well. Again, right there, we heard it today, Peter's failure to really trust Christ. Or on the road to Jerusalem, get behind me, Satan. Or in the Garden of Gethsemane. First he sleeps and then he runs away. And then he goes to the high priest's house and he denies Jesus, he even knows him. So again, he falls again and again and again. But when he had proven to himself that he was unworthy by his constant failure and trusted in the power of God, then his weakness becomes his strength because he's no longer struggling by himself against himself. He recognizes, I can't do this, but you can. And this humility allows the grace of God to work in his life and change what he couldn't change. It's the basic movement of discipleship. Faith, again, we're recognizing that through our own sinfulness, that we turn ourselves over to the grace of God, and he does it for us. So to become president, and I don't care if it's Abraham Lincoln or it's any other president in all American history, it requires great ambition and great determination. If you don't have what they call the fire in the belly, it doesn't happen. Because there are plenty of other people who want it even more. So it requires great ambition and great determination. To become a saint requires great humility and even greater determination. To rise from our falls and trust in the power not of ourselves, but of God. So perhaps you feel like a spiritual failure today. I don't know where you are in your journey, but many times we feel like I'm a failure. Don't give in and don't give up now. So we too, like Lincoln, we have to persevere in prayer and in the spiritual life. Even when it feels like we're getting nowhere. Spiritual growth is not this smooth uphill climb. It's just this beautiful ascent. It's ups and downs. It's rocky. As long as we obey Christ's call and head back out into the deep water for one more cast, we're actually winning. What makes us grow is casting the net. The filling of the net, that's God's problem. As long as we just keep on going, we're spiritually alive. And we advance. And sometimes we think it's only the fish that count. No, it's the humility and the obedience and the charity to just do what Jesus wants us to do. Even if we think, I don't know, this doesn't seem to be getting me anywhere. If you know what Jesus wants you to do, just do it. Keep on doing it. And one day those nets will be full. I mean, Peter has no idea that he would become this leader of the Messiah's movement that day on the seashore. He doesn't know. He's full of doubt. And yet he agrees to try again despite his experiences of failure. And then he begins this road to becoming this great saint. As the gospel says, he leaves everything and he follows him. So we don't know what great thing God has planned for us. It's more than what we are right now, that's for sure. But we will know someday if we keep answering this call of Christ to try again.